Welcome to Happy Writing, your podcast home for taking positive steps forward with your author business. I'm your host and happy writer-in-chief, Dion Abulela. For joining us today, you can get the first 3 months of membership to the Happy Writing Author Lounge for only $5 a month. Simply use the code HAPPYPODCAST and join us over in the Author Lounge. Today's episode is sponsored by Amanda Gernitz Hansen, author of the YA novel Something Beautiful. You can find Something Beautiful at your favorite booksellers such as Amazon, Barnes & Noble, iTunes, or Kobo. Welcome to Happy Writing. Today we are chatting with Theasa Tuohy, the author of the newly released Flying Jenny, The 5 O'Clock Follies, and co-author of an award-winning musical about the life of D.H. Lawrence. Theasa is a New York journalist and author. And her novel that just released, Flying Jenny, was actually largely inspired by Theasa's mother, who, guess what, you guys? She herself was a pilot. And if that's not amazing, I don't know what is. So I'm kind of geeking out about a really strong female inspiration for this novel. And I can't wait to talk to Theasa a little bit more about the inspiration for Flying Jenny and her previous works. So welcome to the show today. We are so excited to have you. If you want to give a little introduction to yourself and tell us what inspires you to write.
Well, I've been sort of doing it all my life. So, since I was a daily journalist for so long, I totally kind of had a work ethic of showing up every day, sitting down at the computer and writing. Um, but I was journalism writing is a bit different from fiction writing, so that was a definite adjustment for me. But the idea of sitting down at the computer every day is just what I've done most of my life. So there's those two separate aspects to my approach to now writing fiction. I love it because it's for the first time in a long time in my working life, I've been able to make things up, and I love that.
That's really neat. And that was actually a question that I had for a little bit farther down my list, but we'll go ahead and do it now. What do you think the biggest difference is in your writing process when you're writing for stage or when you're writing for mass publication or perhaps a fiction novel?
The difference in the process.
Yeah, your personal writing process. Do you have a certain way that you tend to write every single time, or does it differ according to what final medium you're writing for?
Well, they're all different, and the type of writing you need to do is different. And for me, each one of those differences had to be learned. Um, Journalism, as I see it, is very linear. You just sort of sit down and write what happened. Um, Fiction, I had my first novel was rejected several times with the idea that it was vivid, the reader was right there, they were totally engaged, and yet the story didn't work. For a long time, I couldn't understand at all what they meant when they said they loved the writing and they loved this and they loved that, but the story didn't work. I mean, I just didn't really get it. And finally, I came to feel that, as I said, journalism is linear, and fiction is sort of circular in my mind. You have to keep coming back to things. The reader the reader is likes to be along on the journey and see familiar things all the time. Um, so you make references to something, and it felt like to me that when I finally started getting the hang of the difference, um, I it it now sort of somehow it registers because I just sort of make things up as I'm going along, and it will kind of register. Oh, that's a good detail. That's something that would be fun to bring back, whether it's a venue or whether it's a personality trait or um, a weird character that you really didn't see as being part of the major story, just suddenly going. I mean, I can give you an example. In my writers group just a few weeks ago, I'm working on a mystery now with a kind of a scatterbrained actress and who lives in Paris. And in one scene, she is looking all over before she thinks someone is about to murder her. She's looking all over for a pair of uh, slingback silver sandals that she bought at Bon Marché and spent way too much money for, and she can't find them. And it just was something that popped into my head because it just felt funny and frivolous to me. And so help me, 2 weeks ago, I mean, I wrote that scene months ago and read it to the group, and someone in my group said, "So when are the silver sandals coming back?"
Probably because it's so relatable, especially
Exactly.
I know
Exactly.
I've spent way too much on a pair of shoes before and lost them for about 5 minutes, and I thought, oh my goodness.
Right,
So
right, right. No, that's exactly, but that's just a tiny example of the thing I'm trying to express when I say things have to come back.
yeah, and
Um,
a lot of authors that listen to our show are actually first time writers where they're either in their first querying process or they're just starting to tap into writing their first novel. How can an author who hasn't had the experience like we have as far as tightening those fine details, how can they make sure that they create that circular function to bring it all together? I know that's kind of a loaded question, but what advice would you
yeah,
have for an
it
author?
really is. It really is. It's there's just something instinctual. I don't know. I mean, but it's something you should really keep in mind. Um, it goes back to the old thing about Chekhov's gun, which everybody talks about all the time, and it is that sort of thing. I mean,
Mm,
the reader wants to be a part of the situation, feel like it's real, feel like and those kind of tiny, kind of details, signposts, if you will, whatever along the way. And of course, you see, you don't have to worry about that sort of thing in journalism at all. You're not,
yeah.
you're not entertaining anybody, you're giving them information. So it's kind of a very straightforward sort of throw the darts at the dartboard kind of thing. I don't know. I guess I'm coming up with funny examples, but
No, that's fine because I feel like a lot of first drafts that new authors or even less experienced authors do um, kind of do throw a dart at a dartboard, or they're almost journalistic in the fact that for some reason new authors believe their book has to be act one, act two, act three, dot, dot, dot,
yeah,
dot, dot,
yeah.
and they just miss those little details. Um,
Well, I'll tell you what I do. You do drafts. You write
mhm.
the first draft to find out what the story is, where things fit, how it's all, and then you go like on your second draft, you go through and I do what I call layering. Then I like really try to put myself more in the scene and look around and see the details on the street or pick up what the weather's like. Not that a lot of that stuff isn't in the first draft, but that second draft, the expression I use is layering.
Mm,
You go through and add the, the the kind of details, not like the silver shoes because they were organic to the scene, but go through and describe more what's on the table or what the person in the character in the scene is noticing as people walk by on the street. So layering is, to me, is a very expressive term in terms of what you need to use, what you need to do when you go back and start uh, just adding more telling detail, as some writers use the expression.
Yeah. Now, a big conversation that has come about in a lot of online writing groups, as well as with some people that have interviewed with the show, is whether or not an author needs to read in order to write well. Do you think reading is crucial to an author developing their talents?
Well, that's a tough one because everything I've ever read from successful writers is they say read, 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 read,
Mhm.
and yet um, I find that I don't read nearly as much fiction as I used to when I was younger. Um, because I'm doing so much research all the time that
Mm.
most of my most of my reading ends up being picking up details about the history or picking up details about the characters or whatever. I'm the Paris novel that the Paris mystery that I'm working on. Um, the scatty actress character is obsessed with Sarah Bernhardt. So I mean,
Oh.
I've been reading all these things about Sarah Bernhardt. So uh, yes, I read, read, read all the time, but maybe not nearly as much fiction as I should, because when you're reading fiction as a writer, you're seeing how someone handles something slightly differently, or how they uh, well, just their approach. So it feels to me that's why the people are told all the time that you need. Well, maybe when they say read, 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 they're not just talking about fiction. I just always sort of felt that's what they meant, looking for techniques or looking for different approaches or some unusual way that an accomplished writer goes about it. But
Yeah, I think that's very possible. And I like that answer because, oh, I also like asking this question because it's real important that authors learn that there's no one way to do anything. There's no law that says you
oh,
have to write like this or read like
no,
this.
no. I mean, that's
Yeah,
the whole idea. It's totally an individual thing, and it's your vision as opposed to someone else. That's precisely what should make it different, make it interesting, cause readers to be pulled into it because here's something they haven't quite seen before or an experience they haven't quite had. I,
absolutely.
I was speaking to a book club just yesterday, and I was just totally amazed at some of the things the readers had picked up, the things that they asked questions about. Um, and one woman just kept saying over and over, "This is so real. It's so real. I really loved it because you just felt like you were there. You were really able to experience something that none of us knew anything about, including me. I mean, what did I know about 1929, right? I had to just keep reading and picking up details of, of what a certain type of life was like in 1929. One character is a journalist, and the other one is this stunt pilot. What did it feel like to them? So I had to do an awful lot of research and an awful lot of layering and this feeling of what it felt like to be flying an airplane in 1929 or hanging off uh, hanging off the Williamsburg Bridge, trying to get a story.
Yeah.
I love it. It's just fun for me. It really is just fun.
I bet that was a lot of fun to research. And one of my actual favorite books is by Bill Bryson, and um, I believe it's 1928. It's centered around Babe Ruth and Charles Lindbergh.
Yeah, yeah.
And I thought this would be the most boring book in the world, but I picked it up because I was going to be spending a month in a rural Ugandan village with no electricity.
Oh, wow.
And I
Terrible
thought,
story.
oh, that's a story. But it was the fattest book I could find, and I ended up reading it in one night. I just couldn't put it down because the
Wow,
feeling of
wow,
being there. So
wow.
let's talk some about Flying Jenny, because the fact that some of the inspiration is your own mother, who was a pilot in a time when it was, and it still is, a male dominated field, but even back then, so much more. How much of your mother's story is incorporated, and how much is sort of a type of alternative fiction?
Um, you know, Jenny Flynn is the name of the character, the pilot, and she's not my mother. I mean, that's one of the reasons that I've almost backed off from uh, emphasizing too much that my mother was a pilot. Yes, I did grow up on stories about flying. My father was a friend of Paul Braniff, who started Braniff Airline. My father was not a pilot, but he was hanging out all the time with all these guys that were flying. So my mother decided to take flying lessons. So I was always hearing stories about goofy things they did. Um, but my mother was not a debutante and she was not a stunt pilot. She she learned from a guy that was a stunt pilot who was a very well known um, a guy named Roy Hunt who uh, at one time held the world's outside loop record. Now,
Oh,
I threw that out there. I'd heard it all my life from the time I was a child that Roy Hunt held the world's outside loop record. Well, let me tell you, I had to really study to figure out how to how to depict the world's outside loop record and or how to depict an outside loop in the book. And the outside loop is in the book. It's there's a scene at a rodeo in Ponca City, Oklahoma, where um, the Barnstormers are doing some stunts along with the rodeo. So so
yeah.
all that stuff was informed by stories I'd heard, but my mother wasn't a stunt pilot. They Roy tried to get her to do some stunting and she wasn't at all interested in it because every time she flew upside down she was scared she was going to fall out of the airplane.
I don't blame her. But this
Well,
is great because authors can see how you can take a small piece of inspiration and you can end up creating a story, but that doesn't mean that you have to use every single piece or identify 100% with something that may be familiar to you. And so stories can really come from anywhere and develop into anything. They don't have to be limited or have a hard connection to what could possibly be an inspiration.
oh, that's absolutely true. I mean, again, it's something I had never even thought about too much until I was talking to these ladies at the Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church yesterday, uh, who had just read the book, and they were asking me these very kinds of questions, a lot of which just startled me. But they'd say, "Well, what about this?" And where did this come from? And I'd say, "Well." uh, gee, somebody had the name Roy, and I just went off from there. And or I said, but believe me, my father did not have a Duesenberg.
But it would have been so cool if he did.
Right, right. Well, one of the men in the book does have a Duesenberg, but
That's
anyway,
awesome. So, what was your favorite part about constructing Flying Jenny and creating this story that so many people are really feeling is such a story that they can find themselves in?
now the question was, what was my favorite part about the construction?
Yeah, or just creating the story, the writing process. characters?
I don't know. I mean, I work on these things. I do a lot of research, and I work on it over a long period of time. So it's hard for me to say what would be the favorite part, because I really just think it's all fun, and I couldn't say. I mean, well, there was one of the highlights. I'll tell you, this is really crazy, but I was on Google trying to double, triple check. I was pretty sure I remembered correctly that there was an airfield. The woman steals an airplane in Atchison, Kansas, and flies to Ponca City, Oklahoma. And I,
Oh.
I thought, now I just got to make triple sure that there really was an airfield in Ponca City, Oklahoma in 1929. I went on Google to just, all I put in was Ponca City, Oklahoma, and airfield. I came up with the most incredible story. I mean, I was almost dancing around my apartment. It's in the book exactly the way I found it in this news story. And I mean, how lucky could you get? You don't have to sit and be creative. You just go read old newspaper clips and find this crazy stuff. Some guy was hanging off a rope ladder off of a flying airplane, dangling off this rope ladder, trying to land on a Brahma bull at this airfield. I mean, it really happened. And I keep, anybody I talk to about the book, I'm like, I did not make that up. I did not make that up. It, and I'm sure you read it and you think, well, Lord, that's impossible. That couldn't have happened. It happened.
Oh,
So I
that's
stuck it
amazing.
in. Stuck it in. That's the kind of what's my favorite thing. That's one of my favorite things. Just
I
the
that
good
that's
luck,
so funny.
the good luck of stumbling on that, simply because I was being a good reporter and triple checking that there was an airfield.
You never know what you're going to find. And one of my
Exactly.
favorite things to do, I have a box and I put newspaper clippings in it of either stories that are too good to be true or
Right.
names that are too unique to not possibly influence a future character's name.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you just never know where it's going to come from.
Right.
Has
Exactly.
there ever been a chance in your career, especially with your fiction writing, where you've just felt like you wanted to quit or the obstacles were too large and you persevered and kept going? And how did that turn out for you?
Well, it doesn't quite. The situation doesn't quite fit. My first novel, The 5 O'clock Follies. I started working on that years and years ago, but I was working full time. So I mean, I had a job, a staff job as a reporter working full time. So um, I think I had written through that thing about 6 or 7 times, trying to figure out what these people meant, that the story didn't work. And then I just finally put it away for years. And I don't I can't even remember what I felt about it at the time. I'm sure I was disappointed, but I was busy and I had other things going on. And then finally, um, I was at uh, actually MWA, Mystery Writers of America. I used to hang out with them, not because I was a mystery writer, but because I loved their parties. And
Mystery writers are great.
yeah, no, no, that it's a wonderful group. Um, oh, I don't want to say this. I was going to say it's not quite so much fun anymore, but um, they've gotten sort of more organized and more serious. They used to be just basically, it seemed like, good parties all the time. But in any event, I ran into someone there, and I mentioned this 5 o'clock follies that I'd been working on years before, and had just forgotten about it. And he was like, "Oh, that sounds like a fabulous story. Why don't you come into our writers group?" And I was like, well, I don't understand why a writers group would be helpful. I mean, how are they going to, it's a whole book, you know. But he convinced me, and I went into this group a number of years ago, and I'm nuts about him. I'm still with him. I can't imagine now how I ever got along. I mean, I've done three more books with him, and so that was, as you're saying about quitting. It wasn't even a question of quitting. Yeah, I guess I did. I just forgot about it. I This wasn't working, and so it wasn't selling, and sort of that was that.
I
I
think
don't
oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I don't remember any big sensation of, oh, I'm going to have to quit. I,
That's good. We actually get that a lot, which is why I like to ask
yeah,
authors that
yeah,
question.
yeah.
And I
Well, I
think,
obviously had quit, even if I just, it didn't work. It didn't sell. And so I guess I did quit.
well, but you came back to it, and that's important. And authors, I think they really need to realize that if constructive criticism isn't what they want to hear, or they're struggling with their story, it's okay to put it away and come back to it. It's not always perfect the first, it's never perfect the first
Yeah.
time.
It's
I
never
mean,
perfect, period.
yeah, exactly. So there has to come a point where you're able to save your sanity and set it aside if you need to and come back to it, or realize it's good enough. With something that you said also makes me think of the modern age in terms of that particular book not selling and adding frustrations. The modern digital publishing is so saturated, which can be a great thing because now readers have as many books as they want. There's publishers coming up all the time with creative methods for challenging tradition in the industry. But what do you think is the biggest challenge for authors in modern publishing?
Wow.
Another
I
loaded
mean,
question.
I, I have no idea. I'm so challenged technologically that I find it just very difficult. But for young people who grew up with a cell phone in their ear, they wouldn't have this. They, they wouldn't have the same problems at all that I have.
Mm,
I don't know. Uh, I can't imagine what. I mean, you can publish your own book now. You can. Um, I don't know. I'm as I say, I'm sort of technologically disadvantaged. So even though I started writing on a computer almost the second they were created or available to the public, but the computer is different, a completely different animal as far as I'm concerned from the rest of the newer and newer and newer technology. Just as I said, this figuring out how to do this uh, what are we doing? A podcast.
yeah.
Figuring out how to do this was like, oh my God, what am I going to do? I don't have any idea how to set myself up. So, of course, I had to get one of my younger friends over here yesterday to show me what buds were. And and I found an old the microphone I'm using right now is, believe it or not, an old headset, and like a telephone operator's headset that I was using at the AP because I was having carpal tunnel from putting the phone on your ear and shrugging your shoulder and interviewing somebody and typing at the same time.
Yeah. We have a lot of members in our Facebook group and that follow us on Twitter who are also in that same boat. I mean, I remember when I was in high school, we didn't have the internet. When I got my first bachelor's degree, we didn't have the internet in our apartments. And um, I mean, gosh, cell phones weren't really a thing back then either.
Yeah, yeah,
So I connect with that because
yeah.
I feel like my age group luckily did come in at a good time as far as the birth of the internet and being able to use that to some
Right.
degree, but then some of our interns that I work with, I'm like, you did what? How? Wait, what?
Yeah,
So,
yeah, yeah.
yeah, and I think that's a challenge that a lot of our listeners are really going to relate to as well.
Well, I'm
Does
telling you though, Google is the most wonderful thing in the whole world in terms of the research.
yeah,
When
and
I
instant updates, not yearly
oh
encyclopedias.
no, I mean you can find anything. I in my Vietnam novel, some editor said, "Well, you can't just leave her." I mean, my character was on a trying to make her own way to the battle in Way because the army wouldn't take her into the battle zone, so she went on a local bus to get up there, and of course the Viet Cong stopped the bus and took her off, and that's where the scene ended. And some editor said, you can't do that. You can't just leave us. I mean, we don't what did they say to her? How did she figure out what was going on? And I'm like, how would I know? I mean,
Well, that shows a great emotional connection to the character, though. So I consider that a job well done. So,
well, the thing was, I went on Google and in 2 seconds, I can't tell you how fast it was. I found out what the the insignias on their uniforms, how you could tell an enlisted man from a an officer. I found out officers carried one kind of a gun, and so I was
wow.
able to describe these men that were confronting her, which I hadn't even, I just sort of like, well, there they are. She saw these guys, and then she knew she was in trouble, right? But it really added a lot of detail to it. Again, it was just a few more paragraphs or even a few more sentences, but I was so amazed. I was just so amazed that I could get all that really telling detail about those men that were pulling her off the bus.
So I think we can all come to the unequivocal decision that God bless Google. So
Or Bing or whatever else they call it. I just use Bing, a Google, I guess, because I'm old fashioned. But
that's wonderful. Well, this chat has been so fun, and I've really enjoyed hearing more about your writing process for Flying Jenny and some of your past as an author. I know a lot of our listeners will really relate to you. And if
oh,
you're,
I was just going to say, I should tell you that in your area, I think you're in Indiana, right?
we're based out of Indiana, but I currently live in Germany.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, that's the world for you. Well, anyway, my book was chosen in Evansville as the book of the month for June.
Oh,
Uh,
amazing.
yeah, on News 44 in Evansville for their book club. So I was really thrilled about that.
Oh, that's so great. A little Hoosier love. That makes me really proud. Great. Well, if you've come to today's podcast with Tiasa, you can go back to either the Instagram post, Twitter post, or Facebook post that led you here to today's broadcast to find Tiasa's website and social media information. But for those who are just listening and maybe can't get back to that social media post immediately, how can our audience find your website? What's your web address?
It's really easy. It's my name. My name is so totally unique that I that it's theasatuohy.com.
So there you go, everybody. Head on over to Theasa Tuohy. Gosh, I can't talk now. Theasatuohy.com. That's Theasatuohy.
Tuohy.
Oh, I can't even read my own writing. See, the coffee's kicking in.
Right,
So
right, right. Well, Lord knows what time it is in Germany right now.
luckily it's only 3:30, but we have a lot of technological centered work to do today, so that means the coffee is really strong.
Okay,
So
okay, okay.
yeah.
Well,
Well,
good luck. Good luck to you. This has been just a fun chat. I've really enjoyed it as much as I was scared yesterday trying to figure out how I was gonna cope with all this new stuff.
Yeah, well, we're glad it wasn't too scary and we got you in. And on your next book, come back and we'd love to have you again in the future to talk about anything that you've got in the pipeline,
Okay, certainly
especially that
will.
Paris book. I've got to find out what happens to those silver shoes.
We want to thank you for joining us today for the Happy Writing Podcast. And as always, don't forget to head over to happywriting.co and take advantage of that $5 deal just for listening to our podcast. You can join the Author Lounge for $5 for your first 3 months using the code Happy Podcast. If you want to sponsor a future episode, you can also find that information under happywriting.co/podcast. We look forward to seeing you next Tuesday at 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for our next author interview.